The Whispering Shadows. It was the dead of night when Sarah decided to walk home alone from her late shift at the diner. The streets were empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, muffled by the thick fog that had rolled in from the river. She pulled her coat tighter around her and quickened her pace, trying to ignore the unsettling chill that crept up her spine. Sarah had always taken this route home, through the old alley that ran behind the abandoned church. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, thicker somehow, as if the night itself was holding its breath. As she passed the shadow of the church, she heard it, a faint whisper. A voice, distant and cold, but clear enough to send a shiver through her. Sarah. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice sounded like her name, but it wasn't familiar, darker, colder, almost like it was spoken from the other side of the world. She turned around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was no one there. The alley was empty, as it always was. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was probably just the wind, or maybe her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, she heard it again, closer this time. Sarah, come closer. The voice was clearer now, sharper, as if it was right behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but again, there was nothing. Just the eerie silence of the fog-drenched street. Her legs were frozen, unable to move. She could feel her breath coming faster now, shallow and uneven. Something wasn't right. She took a step forward, almost instinctively, but stopped herself just as she reached the end of the alley. From the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure, standing in the shadows of the church. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnervingly as it stepped into the dim light. Its face was hidden in darkness, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, cold, empty, and full of malice. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the air around her seemed to grow colder, the shadows thickening like smoke, swirling and pulling toward the figure. It was as though the darkness itself was alive. Sarah, the voice whispered again, now coming from all around her, like a chorus of voices, each more desperate than the last. The figure's head tilted unnaturally, its body swaying in a jerking, inhuman motion. It took another step forward, and Sarah finally regained control of her legs. She turned and sprinted down the alley, her heart racing as the whispers grew louder, following her, chasing her through the fog. She ran faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her footsteps echoing in the narrow alley. The fog pressed in on her, thick and suffocating, the shadows stretching out like claws trying to grab hold of her. Sarah. The voice again, but this time, it was no longer distant. It was right behind her, whispering directly into her ear. Come back. She dared a glance over her shoulder and saw it. Its face, no longer hidden in the shadows. It was grotesque, twisted, like a broken mask, with hollow eyes and a wide grin that stretched impossibly far across its face. Its mouth was open, and from within, a chorus of voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, whispered in unison. Come back to us. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and for a moment, Sarah felt like the alley itself was alive, shifting and closing in on her. She could feel the shadows crawling up her legs, pulling at her, trying to drag her down. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick fog. She reached the end of the alley, but instead of the open street she was expecting, she was confronted by an impenetrable wall of darkness. The streetlights were gone. Everything was gone. It was as if she had entered another world, a world where the shadows themselves ruled. And then, the whispers stopped. Silence. Complete silence. She stood frozen in the dark, listening to the pounding of her heart, feeling the sweat trickle down her back. She wanted to scream, to shout, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if her voice had been stolen from her. A cold breath brushed against her ear. Don't be afraid, the voice said. But this time, it wasn't just one. It was all of them. Hundreds of voices, speaking in perfect harmony, whispering the same words over and over. Don't be afraid, Sarah. We've been waiting for you. A cold hand brushed against her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows around her twisted and writhed, pulling themselves into a single mass of darkness. Her body was trembling uncontrollably now, her mind screaming for escape. But she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The shadows were closing in, pressing against her skin, curling around her legs, her arms, her throat. And then she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes in the dark. No longer a figure, but a presence, an entity formed of pure darkness, staring at her with those hollow, empty eyes. "Join us," the voice whispered. "You're one of us now." And just like that, the darkness swallowed her whole. The next morning, Sarah's body was found by the side of the alley, lying motionless on the cold pavement. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, but there was no sign of any struggle, no sign of what had happened to her. The whispers stopped, but if you listen closely, sometimes, just sometimes, you might hear them again, calling her name. "Sarah,